there is a child standing in the east corridor of St. James's Palace, and he is counting under his breath. Not 1. Not 2. 14. He mouths it without sound, the way you mouth a prayer you've said so many times it doesn't need air anymore. His lips barely move. His eyes are fixed on the floor, not the painting on the wall that's worth more than most people's lifetimes, not the guard whose bearskin hat scrapes the ceiling almost, not the narrow window leaking November gray onto the stone. Just the floor. Just his feet. Just the number. 14 steps from the door of the king's private drawing room to the first staircase landing. He knows this the way he knows his own heartbeat. I've been working at St. James's Palace for 11 years. I started as a junior household steward, essentially a glorified errand boy in a very old building, and worked my way to senior staff liaison, which sounds important and mostly means I am the person who bridges the gap between the palace's operational staff and the private household. It is a job that requires, above almost everything else, the ability to disappear into a room. To be present without being noticed. To observe without appearing to observe. I am very good at disappearing. Which is how I came to notice the boy. His name is Oliver Beaumont Hatch, and he is 9 years old, and he is the son of one of the senior ladies-in-waiting, Lady Constance Beaumont Hatch, who has served the household for over 2 decades and who carries herself the way very old money teaches you to carry yourself, which is to say like the ground owes her something and is late repaying it. Oliver is brought to the palace occasionally on what the household staff calls companion visits, which is a delicate way of saying that Lady Beaumont Hatch's husband died 3 years ago and her son has nowhere else to be during school holidays, and certain of the household's older members have quietly made allowances for this. The boy is not officially permitted in most of the palace's private quarters. He knows this. He follows the rule precisely, religiously, without being reminded. He just counts, instead, the distance to the places he can't go. The first time I noticed him doing it, I thought he was anxious. Kids in formal spaces often develop small rituals, tugging at collars, counting ceiling tiles, anything to impose order on an environment designed for adults who have spent decades learning to perform ease in rooms that are essentially theatrical sets for power. I wrote it off. The second time, I was carrying a folder of correspondence through the east corridor and I stopped, because I heard him. Not the counting, he's silent when he counts. I heard him stop. Right at the door of the blue drawing room, which is one of the restricted spaces, restricted not for any grand security reason but because it contains documents under active preparation for a state function and the household considers it off limits to non-essential personnel. Oliver stood at the threshold. His toes were exactly at the edge of the runner carpet where the formal corridor began. He looked at the door. He didn't touch it. He took one very deliberate step backward. And then, I watched him turn around and count his way back down the corridor, touching the wall lightly with 2 fingers every 4th step, like a blind man who has learned the braille of a building. I stood there with my folder and I didn't say anything. That evening I asked Mrs. Drelincourt, the palace's head of household operations, a woman who has forgotten more institutional knowledge than most people will ever accumulate, if anyone had spoken to Oliver about the restricted areas. She looked at me over her reading glasses. He doesn't need to be spoken to, she said. He already knows. I know he knows, I said. I meant, has anyone explained why? She was quiet for a moment. His mother, she said finally, explained to him when he first started coming that there are rooms in this building that aren't for everyone. That some spaces require an invitation that can't be given twice. That respect for a place sometimes looks like staying on its outside. She paused. He took it rather literally. I should tell you about the palace itself, because the building matters to this story the way weather matters. It isn't decoration, it is condition. St. James's Palace is not Buckingham Palace. Tourists know Buckingham. They photograph its gates and wait for the guards and press their faces to iron bars hoping to catch a glimpse of something royal. St. James's is different. It is older, quieter, darker in the way that buildings get dark when centuries of consequence have soaked into the stone. It is a working palace, the formal seat of the British court, which means that even now, foreign ambassadors are still officially accredited to the court of St. James's, not to Buckingham. It matters in ways that don't make for good photographs. It is also, in November, the color of a bruise. The red brick goes dark with wet. The courtyards fill with a silence that feels deliberate. The corridors are heated unevenly, some rooms are tropical, others cold enough that you can see your breath near the older windows. The staff learns to dress in layers. The visitors don't last long. Oliver seemed unbothered by any of this. He wore his school uniform, gray trousers, white shirt, a navy jumper that had seen better days, and he moved through the palace with the unhurried seriousness of a small professor conducting fieldwork. I started watching for him the way you start watching for a particular bird once someone tells you it's there. You don't see it until you look. Then, you can't stop seeing it. The third week of November. Lady Beaumont-Hatch had a series of evening obligations and Oliver had been installed in the small staff anteroom near the household offices with a sandwich, a glass of squash, and a book about marine biology that he appeared to be reading with genuine academic intensity. I checked on him twice. He barely looked up. At 6:30, I was walking back through the north corridor toward the staircase that connects to the staff quarters when I saw him. He was standing at the entrance to the tapestry room. Now, the tapestry room is not precisely off limits. It is what we call conditionally accessible, meaning household staff may enter with purpose, visitors may enter on formal tours with escort, but no one wanders in. It is the kind of room that announces its own significance. The tapestries are Flemish, 16th century, the kind of objects that make the air around them feel different. The room is kept at a specific temperature and humidity. You are not supposed to simply drift into it. Oliver had not drifted into it. He was standing at the threshold, which is wide, double doors pushed back against the wall, and he was looking in. His arms were at his sides. His book was tucked under one elbow. He was counting the tapestries he could see from where he stood. I know this because I heard him, very quietly, say 6. Then, pause. Then, say 7, but I can't see the other half of that one properly. He said it to no one. He said it as a fact being recorded. I don't know why that stopped me the way it did. Something about the precision of it. The way he qualified the count, can't see the other half properly, like accuracy mattered more than completion. Like it would have been wrong to count something he couldn't fully see. I cleared my throat. He turned around, not startled, not guilty. Just attentive. You're not supposed to be in this part of the corridor unescorted, I said. I know, he said. I'm at the entrance. The entrance isn't restricted. He was, technically, correct. What are you doing? I asked. He looked at me for a moment with the frank assessment that some children have before they learn to perform social grace. Memorizing, he said. Memorizing what? Everything I can see from where I'm allowed to stand. I have thought about that sentence many times since. Everything I can see from where I'm allowed to stand. There is an entire philosophy in 9 words spoken by a 9-year-old in a palace corridor. I don't want to over-sentimentalize it, he was a child being literal, as children are. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a practice. But, the practice itself. He had decided, and this was a decision, not a passive coping. I became certain of this later, that if a space was inaccessible to him, the correct response was not to resent it, not to forget it, not to pretend it didn't exist. The correct response was to learn everything visible from the boundary. To be present at the edge with complete attention. He was memorizing the exact number of steps between himself and the rooms he could not enter alone. Not because he expected to enter them. Because the distance itself was information. The distance was a kind of knowledge that the interior couldn't give you. I started talking to him after that. Not formally, not by design. Just when I passed him in the corridors, I would slow down. He would look up from whatever he was doing and answer whatever question I hadn't quite asked yet. One afternoon I found him in the ambassador's court, sitting on the bench near the old clock tower, his marine biology book closed on his knee. He was looking up at the King's State Apartments. 3rd floor. The windows that don't open. 22, he said, without preamble. Sorry? Steps. From the bottom of the state staircase to the first landing. I counted from the bottom before someone told me not to go further. Did you count the steps you did take, or the ones you didn't? He thought about this. Both, he said. But, separately. He said it the way you'd say obviously, except he wasn't being unkind. He was being precise. Of course both. Why would you conflate two different kinds of distance? I sat down on the bench next to him. The November light was doing something complicated with the brick, that brief late afternoon angle that makes very old buildings look like they're lit from inside. Oliver wasn't looking at the light. He was looking at the windows. Do you want to go in? I asked. The state apartments. He didn't answer immediately. It's not about wanting in, he said eventually. What is it about? He picked up his book. Opened it to a page with a diagram of a deep-sea creature, something translucent, something that lived in pressure and, dark, something that had learned to generate its own light. My dad used to say, he said, very carefully, like he was carrying each word, that the things you can't have teach you more than the things you can. Because you have to pay better attention. He didn't say anything else. I didn't say anything else. The clock tower started its 6 o'clock sequence and Oliver counted the bells under his breath, and I sat there with him in the court while the palace went dark around its edges and the light inside the windows came on, one room at a time, in rooms neither of us was permitted to enter. December came in like someone had left a window open in the sky. The cold arrived not dramatically, not with first frost or cinema-worthy snow, but as a slow draining of warmth from everything, the way grief works sometimes, the way you don't notice the temperature dropping until you can't remember being warm. The palace staff added a layer. The tourists in the courtyards outside the gates stamped their feet and pointed their phone cameras and breathed fog. The guards on the sentry posts went motionless against it the way they go motionless against everything, which is to say completely, which is to say in a way that stops being human after long enough and becomes something architectural. Oliver Beaumont Hatch came to the palace on the 14th of December. I know the date precisely because it was 2 days before the household began its pre-Christmas preparation in earnest, which means the palace was carrying that specific tension of impending formality, extra staff drafted in, florists consulting with each other in low urgent voices near the service entrances, someone at all times carrying something large and fragile through a corridor not wide enough for it. A controlled chaos with very good posture. I was crossing the Tudor kitchens, which are now used as a service corridor rather than for actual cooking, though they still smell faintly of 5 centuries of roasting meat if you stand in them long enough, when I heard him. Not counting this time. Talking. There is a guardsman named Corporal Daniel O'Say who has been stationed at St. James's for 4 years. He is from Wolverhampton. He is built the way certain men are built who have spent years being told their body is an instrument of state economically, without excess, with a quality of organized stillness that you either find reassuring or unnerving depending on your relationship to authority. Off-duty he is very funny, in the deadpan way of people who have learned that humor is the only honest response to being expected to stand perfectly still for 6 hours while tourists photograph your hat. Oliver had found Corporal O'Say at his post near the gatehouse. I stopped at the edge of the corridor and listened. How do you know, Oliver was asking, when you're allowed to move? There is a protocol for how guards respond to public interaction at St. James's, which is to say there is a protocol for how they do not respond. The guards are not Windsor, they are household division, same discipline, same standard, which means the public-facing expectation is near total impassivity. You do not answer. You do not engage. You stare forward and you become the ceremony. But this was the interior. The interior is different. The rules in the interior have more give. O'Say looked down at Oliver. A long, appraising look. I know my orders, he said. But, how do you know them? Oliver pressed. Like, do you count steps? Or is it more like you just feel where the line is? O'Say was quiet for a moment. Both, he said. Oliver nodded, satisfied, like this confirms something. That's what I thought, he said. I stepped into the corridor. O'Say clocked me immediately, he clocks everything, it's the training, and gave me the micronod that means I am technically still on duty but I acknowledge this is fine. I came to stand beside Oliver, who looked up at me without surprise. He counts too, Oliver said, gesturing at Osei. Does he? Steps. Posts. Intervals. Oliver's voice had the tone of a child reporting a scientific finding. He says the counting is how you keep the discipline from becoming automatic. If it's automatic, you stop choosing it. And if you stop choosing it, you're not standing guard, Osei said, from his post, still facing forward. You're just standing. Oliver pointed at him. Exactly. I looked at Osei. Osei looked at nothing, which is a specific skill. You've been talking to my kid, I said. The young gentleman, Osei said, with great formality, asked a question. It would have been discourteous not to answer. He's not I stopped. He's Lady Beaumont Hatch's son. I know whose son he is. Oliver had stopped listening to us. He was looking at the gatehouse arch, the Tudor brick, the old ironwork, with his chin slightly lifted, calculating something. His lips moved. 41, he said to himself. What's 41? I asked. Steps from here to the door of the guardroom. He pointed. I can see that far. After that I'd need to be inside to know. He said inside the way other children say Hogwarts. I learned, over the weeks of December, that Oliver had been doing this since his first visit to the palace. His mother told me, one afternoon when she'd come to collect him and I was the one he was with, standing in the courtyard while he counted the stones in the outer wall. She stood beside me and watched her son with an expression I recognized, which is the expression of a parent who has arrived, after grief, at a place of genuine wonder at who their child is becoming without their other parent in the room. He started it after his father died, she said, without preamble. I waited. James, my husband, he used to bring Oliver here sometimes. Not officially. He'd walk him to the gates, show him the guards, tell him about the history. She paused. He had a researcher's mind. James. Everything was data. Everything was a fact to be collected and held. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that lives right next to something that isn't a smile at all. Oliver inherited it. But, after James died, it became this. She gestured at her son, who was now lying flat on his back in the courtyard to measure his own body length against the flagstones, counting his heights and stones. The counting, I said. The measuring, she said. The boundary marking. He says she stopped. Started again. He says that if you know exactly how far away something is, it can't disappear. It's still a real distance even if you never cross it. The room is still there even if he's never inside it. Oliver stood up. Dusted his knees. Counted the clouds. Looked satisfied. He's keeping things, Lady Beaumont Hatch said softly. All the things James would have told him about this place that he didn't have time to tell him. Oliver's collecting them from the edges instead. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the cold courtyard wasn't already saying. There is a room in St. James's Palace called the Throne Room. It is, as rooms go, not the most spectacular thing in the building, smaller than you'd imagine, with less gold than movies have led the general public to expect, but it carries a weight that has nothing to do with its dimensions. It is the room in which formal audiences are held. The room in which, for centuries, the machinery of sovereign authority has been made visible in ritual. There is a throne, yes. Two, actually, on a raised dais. The carpet is deep red. The room smells of wax and something older than wax. Oliver had never been inside it. He knew, because of course he always asked someone, that it was 43 steps from the door of the throne room to the dais. He knew this because a member of staff who had done a formal audit of the room for an upcoming ceremony had mentioned it in passing near the household offices, and Oliver had been in the corridor and had heard it and had recorded it in the small navy notebook he carried in the pocket of his school jumper. I found this out because one December afternoon I found Oliver standing outside the throne room doors with his notebook open, writing something. "What are you writing?" I asked. He showed me the page. It was a map. Not a drawing, a diagram. Precise lines, measured and remeasured, laying out the rooms of the palace in relation to each other. But the rooms he'd been inside were drawn in solid lines. The rooms he hadn't were drawn in dotted lines, with numbers noting the distances he'd calculated from doorways, from windows, from overhead plans he'd seen in public historical documents. It was the palace as known from its own edges. A map of approach rather than interior. "Where did you learn to do this?" I asked. "My dad was an architectural historian," he said. "He used to say that you learn more about a building from its threshold than from its center. Because the threshold is where the building decides what to let in." He closed the notebook. "I'm nearly done with the south wing," he said, matter-of-factly. I thought about thresholds for a long time after that. About the discipline of them. About what it means to stand at the boundary of something and choose to understand the boundary itself rather than resent it. To make the distance the subject of your study rather than the obstacle to your subject. Oliver was 9 years old and he had arrived, through grief and through a father's passing gift of a researcher's mind, at something that most adults spend their whole lives avoiding. He wasn't waiting to be allowed inside. He was making the outside count. He was turning the limitation into a form of knowledge. The rooms he was not allowed to enter alone were still real to him. Their walls still held. Their distances were still measurable. They existed in his map, in dotted lines, full of numbers, as known things, held at arm's length things, things whose absence from his direct experience had taught him something that being inside them could never have taught. The 16th of December. The palace preparing for Christmas. Oliver was in the east corridor again, standing at his usual 14-step distance from the door of the king's private drawing room. I was passing with a folder of correspondence. Standard Tuesday. He had his notebook out. He was adding something. I slowed. He was drawing a new room in dotted lines. New discovery? I asked. No, he said. Revision. He held the notebook up. I'd miscounted the steps to the map room. I had 31. It's actually 33. I could see the floor length better today because someone had left the door open at an angle and the light was different. He said miscounted the way a surgeon might say miscalculated a dosage. Serious. Corrective. Not self-punishing. Just accurate. You revised your map, I said. You have to, he said. New information changes the shape of things. He wrote 33 over the crossed-out 31, very carefully, pressing the pen so the correction was clear. New information changes the shape of things, I repeated. He looked up at me with the expression children have when an adult says something they thought was obvious and are mildly surprised it needed saying. Obviously, he said. He closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket. 14 steps behind him, the door of the king's private drawing room held its silence. Oliver turned and walked away down the corridor, touching the wall every fourth step with 2 fingers, counting under his breath, marking his path through the palace like a cartographer who has made peace with the territory he will never be given. The thing about being a witness is that you don't know you're one until the story ends. While you're inside it, you're just a person, walking corridors, carrying folders, watching a child count steps with the mild professional curiosity of someone who is paid to notice things and report them. You're not thinking this is a story I will carry. You're thinking about the correspondence in your folder and whether the florists have confirmed the east entrance arrangement and whether the kitchen is still short-staffed for the 15th. And then, something happens. And, you know. The day I knew happened on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. Lady Beaumont Hatch had been unwell. Nothing dramatic, a chest infection that started around Christmas and lingered with the dogged persistence of things that aren't quite serious enough to treat aggressively but aren't quite mild enough to ignore. She'd continued her duties, because she is the kind of woman for whom continuing is a reflexive condition. But she looked diminished in the way that illness diminishes people who have always seemed impervious to it, slightly smaller, slightly translucent at the edges, the kind of look that makes people around her careful in a way they weren't before. Oliver had been brought to the palace by a family friend on that Wednesday, a Mrs. Pellegrino, round and warm and entirely out of her element in a palace environment, who delivered him at the staff entrance with the air of someone completing a difficult relay and was clearly relieved to hand the baton. Oliver, for his part, arrived with his navy jumper, his notebook, and a new pencil he'd been given for Christmas that was mechanical and had a retractable tip he kept clicking. I was assigned, loosely, informally, to keep an eye on him while his mother rested in the household offices. Oliver accepted this the way he accepted everything about the palace, as an arrangement within his system of rules that he had already internalized. He nodded at me, clicked his pencil once, and said, "Can we start in the ambassador's court?" We started in the ambassador's court. He had a specific route. I realized this after 20 minutes. He wasn't wandering. He was moving through the palace on a circuit he had clearly mapped, not the notebook map, something internal, a route held in the body rather than on paper. He knew which corridors connected to which. He knew where the restricted doors were before we reached them. He slowed at each one, not to press against the boundary but to verify it, to confirm the count, to notate. I walked beside him. He narrated, occasionally. 19 steps from the tapestry room entrance to the green drawing room corridor junction. I revised that up from 17. I think I was taking shorter steps the first time because I was wearing shoes that were too tight. He said I revised the way a scientist says the literature was updated. Do you have every room in the palace mapped? I asked. Not every room. He clicked his pencil. There are rooms I haven't found a valid vantage for yet. The private dining room on the second floor, I can see the door from the corridor but the angle doesn't give me any floor. So I only have approach distance, not interior proportion. Interior proportion, I said. How wide and how deep a room is. You can sometimes calculate it from the window positions if the curtains aren't drawn. He glanced at me. I mapped the armory corridor that way. There are 3 windows and, based on the spacing, they're about 4 meters apart, which gives me an estimated room length of Oliver. What? How long have you been doing this? He considered. Since Dad died, he said. Like it was obvious. Like cause and effect were so clear he'd never thought to explain them. Why? He stopped walking. We were at the end of the east corridor, the full length of it stretching behind us, afternoon light coming through the windows in bars across the runner carpet. He looked at the corridor the way people look at a view they're about to leave. Because he was supposed to show me, Oliver said. He had a hole, he clicked the pencil. He had a plan. He was going to bring me every holiday and show me one room at a time. He had a list. He paused. I found the list in his desk after the funeral. He'd written down the rooms in order, starting with the public ones and working inward. A long pause. He didn't get very far. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't fill the space with explanation or elaboration. He just let the sentence sit there in the corridor and breathed in and clicked his pencil and said, "This way." He turned left. I followed. We came to a room I hadn't expected him to bring us to. At the end of the north corridor, past the household offices, past the small anteroom where he ate his sandwiches and read about marine biology, there is a room that most of the day-to-day staff doesn't give much thought to. It's not marked with anything formal. The door is unremarkable pale wood, simple handle, the same institutional quality as half the service area doors in the palace. But it's one of the conditional access rooms, meaning there are circumstances under which it's restricted. I'd never seen Oliver come near it. He stopped in front of it. He looked at the door for a long time. Then, he opened his notebook to a page near the back. The page had a diagram. The room in question, I could tell by the corridor junction he'd sketched, the window position markers, the notated distances from the point he'd been able to measure from. The room was drawn in dotted lines. Outside its boundary, in his precise small handwriting, a note, Dad's list, room 7. Painted chamber, historic designation, currently used as secondary meeting room. Said to have original Tudor stonework beneath the plaster. He wanted to show me the stone. I read it twice. He had it on his list, Oliver said, looking at the door. It was 7th. He said the stone under the plaster was the same stone that people had walked on when the palace was first built. He said if you knew where to look you could find a handprint in the plaster where a mason had steadied himself. 500 years old. He clicked his pencil. He never got to show me. He was quiet. I've measured the approach 17 times, he said. From 4 different vantage points in the corridor. I have a very accurate exterior sense of the room. He said exterior sense with no irony, no self-pity. A technical term for a technical competence. But, you can't see the stone, I said. No. Or the handprint. No. He looked at the door. It's still there, though, he said. The handprint. Whether I see it or not. It's still a real thing. I know it's 17 steps from the junction. I know there's a window on the south wall based on the light under the door. I know the room exists. He closed the notebook. Dad used to say, he said, very carefully, that love for a thing doesn't require possession of it. You can love something from the outside. You can love it from the count. He put the notebook in his pocket. We stood there in front of the door of the painted chamber. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel what I felt. It would be dishonest, and I've tried to be honest throughout all of this. What I felt was something I don't have a clean word for, something between grief and admiration and the specific ache that happens when a child shows you an understanding of loss that adults spend their whole lives working toward and usually manage only once they're old enough to have earned it the hard way. Oliver hadn't had the hard way arrive on a schedule. It had arrived at 6 years old. And he had turned it, with the precision of his father's mind and the tenacity of his own, into a practice. Into a discipline. Into a cartography of everything he couldn't hold. I made a decision. I am a senior staff liaison, which means that one of the things within my purview technically, rarely invoked, is the ability to authorize supervised non-standard access to conditional access areas for purposes that fall under the category of historical and educational interest. It is not a power I use often. It exists mainly for visiting academics and, occasionally for journalists working on approved pieces about the palace's history. I used it then. I went to Mrs. Drellincourt. I explained what I wanted and why. She looked at me over her glasses for a long time. The painted chamber, she said. Yes. For the Beaumont Hatch boy. Yes. Because of his father's list. I'd explained it. She'd listened without expression, in the way she listens to everything, which is to say completely. The mason's handprint, she said. Yes. Another long pause. Supervised, she said. Of course. You with him? Yes. She looked back at her papers. Made a note. Set her pen down. Friday, she said. 2 o'clock. Before the Thursday correspondence meeting moves into the north section. She didn't look up again. Thank you, I said. She said nothing. I didn't tell Oliver. I told Lady Beaumont Hatch, who looked at me for a long moment and then looked at the window and pressed her hand to her mouth briefly in the way of people containing something that would embarrass them to release in professional company. James would have, she started. She stopped. Tried again. Thank you, she said. Friday. 2 o'clock. Oliver arrived in his navy jumper and his school trousers and his mechanical pencil and his notebook. He did not know where we were going. I had told him only that I had somewhere to show him. He followed me through the east corridor, through the household offices, down the north corridor. When we reached the door of the painted chamber, he stopped. He looked at the door. He looked at me. The painted chamber, he said. Not a question. Yes. It's on Dad's list. I know. Number 7. I know. He looked at the door again. His notebook was in his hand, but he wasn't opening it. He just held it. I've measured the approach, he said, very quietly. 17 steps from the junction. I know the exterior well. I know you do, I said. I opened the door. The room was smaller than I think he'd expected. They often are, the first time. The maps, the estimates, the exterior sense, they give you a version of a room that is never quite the room. The room asserts itself. It says, I am this, not that. I am narrower than your imagination and taller than your calculation, and my light comes from a direction you didn't account for. Oliver stood just inside the threshold. He looked at the ceiling first. Then, the walls. Then, the floor. Taking inventory. Reorganizing his dotted line diagram into solid lines. Then, he looked at the south wall. And, he found it. It was lower than eye level, his eye level, mine would have been above it. A section of wall near the old fireplace surround where the plaster had been cut away and sealed behind glass to reveal the stone beneath. A conservation measure, you couldn't touch it, but you could see it. And, in the stone, 500 years old, pressed into the mortar between two courses of Tudor brick, a handprint. A mason's handprint. Fingers splayed. The weight of someone steadying himself while the palace was being built. Oliver walked to it. He stood in front of the glass. He looked at the handprint. He was quiet for a long time. Then, he opened his notebook. He began to draw it. Not from a threshold this time. From inside the room, close to the wall, his pencil moving carefully over the page while he sketched the proportions of the handprint, the spacing of the fingers, the faint impression of the heel of a palm. He drew it in solid lines. First solid line room in the notebook. He drew it without looking up, without speaking, with the complete and unself-conscious focus of a child doing something that is not performing. Just doing. Just being inside the room that his father had planned to show him, holding the pencil his father would have held, seeing the stone his father had meant to point at. He was very careful. He was very precise. When he finished, he closed the notebook. He held it against his chest for a moment. Then, he looked at me. He would have told me, Oliver said, that the handprint is 500 years old, but it still fits a human hand. That people haven't changed the size of their palms in 5 centuries. That the man who pressed that into the mortar was probably the same height and weight as a normal person. That we'd probably recognize each other if we met. He looked back at the handprint. He talked like that, he said. Everything connected to everything. He put the notebook in his pocket. Thank you, he said. For bringing me in. We walked back through the north corridor, past the household offices, back into the east wing. Oliver's hand trailed along the wall, 2 fingers, every 4th step, the way he always walked. But, something was different. He wasn't counting. He was just touching. Just making contact with the building. Just being inside it without measuring the distance. At the junction of the east corridor he stopped. He looked back down the length of the palace we'd walked through. I'll keep the dotted lines, he said. For the rooms I haven't been in. But, I'll need a new symbol. For rooms I've been in but am not allowed in alone. What symbol? He thought. A handprint, he said. Small. In the corner of the room. He clicked his pencil once. Everyone who's been somewhere, he said, leaves a mark. Even if they're not allowed back. I've worked at St. James's Palace for 11 years. I've seen state ceremonies and security panics and a visiting dignitary's dog who ate an arrangement of flowers worth more than my monthly salary. I've seen things go right and wrong with equal theatrical consequence. I've been in most of the rooms. I've stood on most of the carpets. I know, broadly, where everything is. But I learned something from a 9-year-old boy with a navy notebook and a mechanical pencil and a father's list of rooms he never got to finish. The rooms you are not allowed to enter alone are still real. The distance to them is measurable. The approach is knowable. The exterior reveals more than you'd think if you stand at the boundary with enough patience and enough attention. And, the number of steps, the exact number, revised carefully as new information arrives, is itself a form of knowledge that the interior could never give you. Because to know the interior, you only need to go inside. To know the distance, you have to choose to stand at the edge and pay attention to the edge itself. Oliver Beaumont Hatch chose that. Not because he had to. Because he understood, with the precision of grief and the stubbornness of love, that the things you cannot hold still exist inside the holding. He turns 10 in March. His mother told me he's been asking whether he can bring his birthday into the palace. Not a party. Not anything formal. Just to be here, on the day, with his notebook. I told her I'd see what I could arrange. I will arrange something. I already know I will. Because the distance to that answer is very short. And some rooms are worth opening.